I pulled the spare helmet from the side of my black motorcycle and held it out to the woman walking alone along the highway. She stopped by the guardrail. Her fingers looped around the strap of her heavy canvas backpack and asked, "Is this how you pick up girls?" I glanced at the crumpled address clutched in her other hand. "Only the ones walking toward a house that's been empty for 2 years. She didn't reach for the helmet. Standing there in a white tank top, denim shorts, and a plaid shirt tied casually around her waist, she looked dusty from the roadside, yet completely unafraid. Her faint smile faded as she scrutinized my face, the bike, and the license plate, in that exact order. "Show me some ID," she said, "and tell me why you know anything about that house." Keeping the engine idling, I moved slowly so she could track both my hands. My wallet held a standard driver's license and a staff badge from the Alder Ridge Outdoor Center. I extended them toward her without demanding she step closer. "My name is Cole McKinney. I manage the outdoor center up the river, and I live right next door to the address you're holding. The Bishop family moved away 2 years ago, and the place has stayed locked up ever since." She studied the badge, snapped a quick photo of my license plate with her phone, and looked back up. "You could still be lying." "I could," I admitted, nodding toward the open road behind her. "You can keep walking, you can call the center and ask for me directly, or I can take you to the property and wait outside the gate." The afternoon heat shimmered visibly over the asphalt. We were a good 2 miles out of town, and the final bus had passed us by half an hour ago. She scanned the empty stretch of highway, then reached out and took the helmet. "I'm Kathy Ryan," she said. "You're taking me to that house, and you're going to explain anything unusual before I even have to ask." "Fair enough." She strapped the helmet on herself. The ride was brief, turning off the highway onto a quiet county road canopied by tall Douglas firs. Kathy maintained a polite inch of distance, gripping the rear grab strap instead of wrapping her arms around my waist. She leaned smoothly into every curve, never once grabbing at me when the road tightened. She had accepted a lift, nothing more. I killed the engine at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The house sat tucked in the pine shadows, its paint flaking off the walls and a faded, for sale sign hammered deep into the dry front lawn. Kathy pulled off the helmet and handed it back, walking straight up to the porch to peer through the dusty glass of the front door. She pulled out her phone and dialed. In the deep quiet of the woods, I could clearly hear the automated carrier voice state that the number was no longer in service. She lowered the phone, letting out a long, slow breath. "You're looking for Stephanie," I said, stepping off the bike. She spun around, her posture locking up instantly. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Stephanie Bishop asked me to keep an eye on the place until the real estate agent clears out the final boxes this Friday," I told her, staying by the bike so as not to crowd the porch. "And because she left a heavy wooden trunk in the living room that she mentioned an old friend might eventually come looking for." Kathy reached into her pocket and pulled out another folded piece of paper. A slightly blurry printed photo of a dark oak chest with heavy brass hardware. "She sent me this 3 years ago," Kathy said. "There's a stamp on the bottom corner of the brass that looks like a 1930s forestry surveying kit. Are you a buyer?" "I run an online vintage shop," she added, her tone shifting to professional detachment as an invisible wall slid into place. "Though I'm not here to buy it. I'm here to authenticate it for her." We lost touch, and I suppose I thought showing up in person was the only way she'd answer the door. I looked from the house back to her. The sun was dipping low behind the treetops. She didn't have a car, and the local taxi service usually stopped taking calls after 4 o'clock. "I have the key to the house," I said, "but I don't have permission to let you open that trunk, not without hearing it directly from Stephanie." "I can tell you what it's worth in 10 minutes, she offered. "I believe you," But it's still not my trunk. She didn't argue, and that mattered. She accepted the boundary because it protected Stephanie's property, not because it was convenient for her. Then she cast a glance down the empty road, realizing the practical problem had returned. My house is the cedar cabin right through the trees, I said, pointing toward a roofline beyond the pines. I have a guest room with an interior lock and its own bathroom. You're welcome to use it tonight. Tomorrow, I'll contact Stephanie and ask about the trunk. Kathy adjusted her backpack. What's the catch? Nothing. Nothing usually comes with terms later. Then let's set the terms right now. She studied me for a beat. If the bedroom door is closed, it stays closed. You don't read my work, and you don't ask why I own 3 cameras but only 2 pairs of shoes. I pay for my own food. I wasn't planning on taking inventory of your footwear, but it's a deal. We walked down the narrow deer path connecting the 2 properties. My cedar house was practical, quiet, and straightforward. I showed her the guest room, the bathroom, and the window latch. She tested the deadbolt herself. I handed her a spare front door key, mentioning that the mudroom light stayed on all night, before stepping back into the hallway and letting her close the door. Her backpack landed unopened at the foot of the bed. The dresser and walls were completely bare. I had intentionally built a guest room that asked nothing of anyone, not even whether they intended to stick around past breakfast. I went straight to the kitchen and drafted an email to Stephanie Bishop. 20 minutes later, Kathy emerged with damp hair, her phone plugged into a charger she'd brought herself. I'm making pasta, I said. There's enough for 2. I added, that isn't a hidden room rate. She looked from the pot to me. Accepting half a plate of food seemed to require genuine deliberation. All right, she finally agreed. But I'm buying breakfast. You can try. The nearest store closes in 12 minutes. She checked the clock, took the plate, and sat down at the far end of the kitchen island. We ate in a comfortable silence, avoiding forced small talk. When she finished, she asked where to leave the dish. I pointed to the sink. She set it there instead of washing it, which told me she understood the offer for what it was. I didn't pry into why a woman capable of identifying a 1930s surveying kit from a blurry photo had waited 3 years to knock on her friend's door. That answer belonged solely to her. For now, so did the closed guest room door. The next morning, the heavy scent of rain hung in the air. I was at the kitchen counter cross-referencing river levels with our guide schedule when Kathy walked out wearing dark jeans and a plain gray sweater, her hair twisted into an efficient knot. She had already found the coffee and set a wrapped blueberry muffin from her backpack right between us. Emergency breakfast, she announced. Bought it before the bus ride. Looks like we each get half an emergency. She broke it cleanly in 2, taking the smaller piece before I could object. Then she spotted my phone on the counter. She replied, I said, sliding it over. Kathy scanned the screen, where a voice memo from Stephanie waited. I tapped play. Cole, if it's really Kathy, let her look at the trunk. Tell her the movers are coming Friday at 5 to clear the rest of the house for the dump or donation. She has until then to tell me if that old wooden box is even worth saving. The message clicked off. It was Tuesday. She had 4 days. Let's go open a house, I said. The air inside the Bishop place was stale, thick with dry dust and old pine. I unlocked the heavy front door and led her into the living room. The trunk sat right in the center of the floor, a massive piece of dark wood and oxidized brass. I stepped back and let her work. Kathy didn't just look at it. She studied it. Her hands hovered over the wood, tracing the grain, feeling the tension in the antique hinges. When she popped the latches, a rich scent of old paper, aged leather, and machine oil drifted up. Inside lay a heavy brass compass, a rolled canvas map, stacks of rigid route cards, and a leather-bound logbook. "It's a complete field kit," she murmured, lifting the compass with immense reverence and angling it toward the grime-streaked window. "There's a maker's mark here and a specific route number." Pulling a small magnifying glass and a notebook from her bag, she spent the next hour utterly ignoring my existence. She photographed every item, cross-referencing serial marks on her phone, with deep concentration knitting her brow. "I can't authenticate this here," she finally said, sitting back on her heels. "The route numbers look like Forest Service grid numbers, but the field notes are entirely local. I need old trail records to prove where it was actually used. My center holds the original trailhead files for this part of the valley," I told her. "If those numbers belong to Alder Ridge, the answer is sitting right in my archive room." She looked up at me. "How much will you charge me for access?" "Nothing. But if this is the original survey for the basin, I need to know what the information is worth to the community, not just what the brass is worth to a private buyer." She thought it over carefully. "The movers arrive Friday at 5. If I have to haul these items to a motel, I'll lose valuable time trying to coordinate access to your archives. The guest room is yours until Friday." I pulled a slip of paper from my pocket and set it on the dusty lid of the trunk. "That's the number for the Pinecrest Motel, just in case you'd prefer neutral ground." She looked at the paper, then back at me. I left it where she could see it because I wanted her to have a genuine choice, even if she ultimately picked my house. "I'll stay at your place," she decided, pulling a pen from her pocket to scribble on the back of the motel slip. "I work from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. I need table space, Wi-Fi, and somewhere secure for the camera." Done. We packed the pieces up separately and used a hand truck from the center to roll the heavy trunk over. By noon, my dining room looked like a professional curation lab. That afternoon, I brought her down to the Alder Ridge Outdoor Center. The timber-framed building always smelled faintly of neoprene, wet paddles, and pine needles. Down the back hall, our archive held 70 years of trail records filed away in gray metal cabinets. I unlocked the door and gestured to the rows. "The oldest files are in the gray cabinets on the left. Just keep the folders organized." I didn't hover. I retreated to my office down the hall, where a group organizer was already waiting on speakerphone to argue about a canceled rafting trip. The upper river had swelled overnight, and the narrow channel was carrying broken branches fast enough to shatter a paddle shaft. "You sold us a full-day run," the organizer complained. "My clients flew in specifically for this." "I sold you a run under safe conditions," I replied evenly. "Those conditions are gone. We can shift you to the lower section or issue a full refund for the day. We are not putting 12 people into that channel." He pushed twice more. I repeated the exact choices, closed the route on the staff board, and reassigned 2 guides. Being liked was useful. Being trusted was infinitely better. An hour later, Kathy appeared in my doorway holding the compass in one hand and a yellowed map in the other. She had overheard enough of my call to know I didn't bend safety rules just because someone threw a fit. She didn't offer empty praise. She simply placed the map on my desk with the careful reverence of someone who understood why rules existed in the first place. "The wear mark on this compass matches a field correction on this 1934 ridge map," she said. "Same route code, same survey handwriting. This kit mapped the exact trails your center still uses." That was all the technical verification I needed. The real proof was in the way her face softened as she spoke. The guarded woman from the highway had completely vanished. She leaned over my desk, one finger tracing a faded line, entirely absorbed in her own certainty. I stepped closer to see the mark, our shoulders nearly brushing. Kathy looked up and caught me watching her instead of the map. "What?" she asked softly. "You're remarkably good at this." A faint flush touched her neck, though she didn't step away. "You can identify a 90-year-old survey hand, yet you still walked 2 miles toward an abandoned house." Her mouth curved. "My attention is selective. It's exceptional work, Kathy." I let the compliment hang in the air before adding, "I'm making steak and roasted potatoes tonight. I'd like you to have dinner with me." The night before, she had simply needed food. This time, I wanted her company. She picked up the compass. "Are you asking the appraiser or the woman from the highway?" "The appraiser already has archive access." "I'm asking you." She held my gaze for a long moment, then looked down at the map. "Ask me again after I finish work." When we got back to the house, I set up a small desk in the corner of the living room featuring a locking drawer. I handed her the key. "For the camera and the logbook," I said. "You shouldn't have to haul your business into the bathroom every time you step away from the table." She closed her fingers around the metal key. "Thank you." She thanked me once, locked her gear away safely, and went straight back to work. By evening, our dining table had naturally developed a border. Her half was crowded with canvas maps, cotton gloves, a magnifying glass, and 3 pencils lined up by length. My half held a salt grinder and a single folded newspaper. I set a glass of water 6 inches over the invisible line. Kathy casually slid it back without looking up. "International border?" I asked. "Preservation zone." Her phone buzzed before I could reply. She took the call in the calm, steely voice reserved strictly for business. "No, I won't separate the compass from the set. The price isn't the issue. The provenance is incomplete, and I won't sell a story I can't prove." She listened for a moment longer, then ended the call without a single apology. She was willingly walking away from a fast sale to do the work right. I understood that kind of stubbornness inside and out. At 7:45, I placed a plate on the bare half of the table. She glanced at the food, checked the time, and finished labeling one final photograph before clicking her notebook shut. She ate what I had made without offering to cook tomorrow or scrub the kitchen in exchange. Halfway through the meal, she brought up the closed river route. "The customer sounded furious," she noted. "He was." "You didn't sound bothered." "I was bothered. It just didn't make the river any safer." She nodded once, the exact same gesture of acceptance she had given at the locked trunk. A boundary was only worth having if it survived the inconvenience. At exactly 8 o'clock, she carried our plates to the sink, left them there and brewed tea. She set one mug on the empty side of the table and sat across from it. "You get one question," she said. "Not about the trunk. Not about the Forest Service." That was her answer to my dinner invitation. She was carving out time that had nothing to do with business, yet she still insisted on defining the boundaries. One question. No ambos. I sat across from her as the house settled into a quiet hum, broken only by the refrigerator and the wind brushing the cedars outside. "Why didn't you call Stephanie before you came out here?" Kathy held her mug in both hands. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. 3 years ago, my business failed. She finally spoke, her voice quiet. "I lost my apartment in Seattle and sold most of my inventory just to cover my debts. Stephanie offered me her guest room here, and I told her I was simply too busy with a new contract." Her thumb traced the ceramic rim of the mug. "There was no contract. I was just deeply ashamed." Then a month passed, then 6. After a while, every missed call required an explanation I had no idea how to give. She stared out toward the dark window. Showing up with a backpack felt infinitely easier than admitting I had hidden from the one person who offered to help. I didn't offer the cliché that Stephanie would understand. That wasn't mine to promise. You came anyway, I said softly. 3 years late. Late isn't the same as never. Her eyes met mine again, and the tension in her shoulders finally eased. Not entirely, but enough to notice. I genuinely hate being stuck. I glanced toward the backpack visible through the open guest room door. You certainly look prepared not to be. She followed my gaze but didn't answer. Our one-question hour was up, and I didn't push for a second. We finished our tea in silence while the ancient maps rested between us like an unspoken truce. Stephanie called on Wednesday evening. I overheard the initial stiff exchange from the kitchen, grabbed my coffee, and stepped out onto the back step, pulling the screen door shut behind me. The conversation wasn't mine to listen to. Yet even through the glass, I heard Kathy say, "I know sorry doesn't repair 3 years of silence." A heavy pause followed, then her voice returned, thinner this time. "No. You weren't foolish for offering me that room. I made you feel foolish because I vanished the moment you extended kindness. That's on me, not you." The silence that followed lasted long enough for the sound of the wind to fade from my awareness. "I understand," Kathy said quietly. "I'll finish the catalog by Friday. You don't have to trust me before then. And honestly, you don't have to trust me after it either." I stayed on the porch until the call wrapped up. When I stepped back inside, Kathy was sitting on the sofa with her phone resting face down beside her. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, though she wasn't crying. That kind of rigid restraint looked exhausting. I set a glass of water near her hand. She drank half of it before speaking. "She said the hardest part wasn't that I needed help," Kathy murmured. "It was that I made her question whether our friendship only mattered when my life looked successful." I sat in the armchair across from her. "Did she say if she'll forgive you?" "She said she doesn't know if a single apology changes anything, but she wants the catalog finished. After that, she'll decide whether she ever wants to talk again." That sounds honest. It is. Kathy glanced toward the guest room. It hurts precisely because she's right. She stood up, walked over to the backpack resting at the foot of the bed, and wrapped her hand around the top handle. For a second, I thought she was going to pack up and leave before anyone else could dictate what happened next. Instead, she just stood there, staring down at the canvas. "My absolute first instinct is to run," she admitted. "Not because she told me to, but because staying long enough to potentially disappoint her again feels unbearable." I stayed right in the doorway, leaving the path to the front door completely open. "Do you want quiet, or do you want company?" I asked. Kathy let go of the handle. "Company. No advice." I sat down on the floor just outside the guest room threshold, while she took a seat on the edge of the mattress. We didn't solve a single thing, but after a while, she opened her laptop and pulled the catalog file back up on the screen. The true cost of returning to Stephanie wasn't immediate forgiveness. It was simply staying through the uncomfortable space where forgiveness hadn't arrived yet. The guest room door stood wide open behind her, and her canvas backpack remained fully zipped. She had been living under my roof for 2 days and hadn't even unpacked a single shirt into the dresser. "You never unpack," I noted later that evening after she saved her work and the house grew quiet. Kathy followed my gaze. "It's a lot easier to leave when you haven't spread out." Then she looked around my living room, clean, functional, and almost entirely devoid of personal fingerprints. No family photos, no stray stacks of mail, no blanket thrown over the arm of the sofa. "You never ask anyone to stay either. This house makes it remarkably easy for a guest to vanish in the morning." She had read me with the exact same precision she brought to the historical archives. I liked providing what people needed, I simply hated admitting that I wanted more than that. A useful room couldn't reject me, but a person could. I looked back toward the empty dresser. Do you need more hangers? That isn't what you were actually going to say.
No.
Well, what were you going to say? I met her eyes squarely. Nothing that I have any right to say while you still need this room. Her answer shifted something subtle between us. Not enough to completely settle the air, but enough that neither of us looked away. I like you, Kathy, I said. The room has nothing to do with that. Larry Williams runs the antique exchange downtown, I added after a beat. He has secure storage units opening up for the trunk starting Friday. The Pinecrest Motel also had a cancellation. Room 12 is open tomorrow night if you want it. Kathy went entirely still. Are you asking me to leave?
No.
I'm making sure you're able to. Why? Because the trunk is here, the archives are here, and you arrived after the last bus. Right now, staying here is just the easiest option. I want it to remain an option, not an obligation. The words sounded clean, but they didn't feel clean at all. I had spent years making departures effortless for everyone who passed through my life. This was the absolute first time I hated the thought that someone might actually use one. Kathy watched me for a long, quiet moment, then pulled up the motel's website on her phone. She booked room 12 for Friday night, bypassing Thursday entirely. I'm staying right here through the deadline, she said. The desk setup is better, and hauling this kit twice would be idiotic. On Friday, I'll hand you back the key. Understood. She set her phone down. When I don't need your guest room anymore, are you still going to ask me to dinner? Yes. I didn't hide behind any practical answers this time. I like you, Kathy. The room has nothing to do with it. Her expression softened. Good. Ask me again on Friday. Thursday shifted everything. Kathy didn't just authenticate the pieces. She digitized the old trail maps, matched them flawlessly to the compass and logbook photographs, and built a comprehensive catalog that explained why the entire set mattered as a cohesive whole. If someone buys the brass alone, it's just decoration, she told me when I came home that evening. If the logbook ties it directly to the trails your center still maintains, Stephanie gets to make her choice with the complete story in front of her. She had moved her workspace from the center of the dining table over to the window, catching the better afternoon light. A small desk lamp bought from the town hardware store sat beside her laptop, one she had paid for entirely out of her own pocket. 2 archive boxes rested open on the floor, each labeled with her meticulous numbering system. This card dates the North Ridge map 7 years too late, she pointed out, tapping the screen. Change it. She looked up, surprised. It's your archive. You should lead this part. Your judgment is what matters here, I told her. She corrected the card, added her initials, and slid it back into the folder. My archive now permanently carried the evidence of her mind, not just the ghost of someone passing through. I leaned over the digital layout. I've had these files for 5 years and never saw the story hidden in them. You knew the trails, she said softly. I knew what the objects were saying. We needed both. Her casual use of the word "we" lingered in my mind long after she spoke. Later that afternoon, she had a meeting with Larry at his shop to finalize the transfer of the trunk. I walked out to the driveway to warm up the motorcycle, grabbing my helmet and reaching for the spare hanging off the back bar. Before my fingers even brushed the strap, Kathy stepped up, took the spare helmet herself, and strapped it on. The first time we met, she had forced me to show identification before she'd even touched that helmet. This time, she took it as if it already belonged in our routine. She climbed onto the back of the bike, and this time she didn't leave a deliberate inch of space between us. Her hands rested lightly on my waist, and she leaned into every single turn all the way into town. At the antique shop, Larry spent 10 minutes examining the compass and 20 studying Kathy's sample catalog. He asked sharper questions than I expected, but Kathy answered every single one without ever overselling the collection. "I've got 40 boxes of estate pieces in the back," Larry grunted, rubbing his chin. "Half of them have labels written by people who thought old was a valid date. I can pay you for a 1-month cataloging project." He nodded toward the ceiling. "There's a studio apartment upstairs, separate rent, month to month. It's small, but the locks work and the windows open." Kathy didn't look at me for approval or permission. She simply asked to see the room. We climbed a narrow wooden staircase behind the shop. The studio featured worn floorboards, a shallow kitchen sink, 2 tall windows, and enough unbroken wall space for a photography backdrop. It wasn't polished, but it was solid. More importantly, it could be entirely hers. Kathy checked the window latches, tested the water pressure, and checked the outlets along the widest wall before asking Larry for the exact rent and day rates in plain numbers. When he gave them, she didn't hesitate. "I'll take the project and the room, starting Friday at 5. Only then did she glance at me. I kept my face completely neutral because the choice belonged entirely to her. Inside my chest, something tightened and eased at the exact same moment. She had found a place. It just wasn't under my roof. Friday arrived with the strict deadline and brilliantly clear weather, 2 things I secretly preferred. At 4 o'clock, we loaded the oak trunk into the outdoor center's pickup truck and drove it over to Larry's secure storage room. Stephanie had finally chosen to keep the set together after reading Kathy's draft catalog. The decision had arrived via a short voice memo. "I'm keeping the kit. The catalog is exceptional. We can talk on Sunday, though I'm not promising anything more than that yet." Kathy listened to it once and tucked her phone away. There was no instant, magical forgiveness, but there was an open line of communication. For now, that was more than enough. The movers reached the Bishop house right at 5. By 6, the old rooms were completely empty. The trunk was safely stored, and Kathy's canvas backpack sat squarely on the floor of the studio above Larry's shop. I carried her final camera case upstairs and set it on the small kitchen counter. The air smelled faintly of brick dust and lemon cleaner. A brand new key rested in Kathy's palm. She unzipped her backpack, and instead of pulling out her laptop as she always did, she lifted 2 folded sweaters from the top and placed them directly into the narrow dresser drawer, following them with a neat stack of shirts. It was a small, quiet gesture, but I had never once seen her do it in my house. "You're actually unpacking," I noted. She looked down at the open drawer. "I signed a month's lease." "That isn't what I meant." "I know." Her hand rested lightly against the edge of the wooden drawer. "I'm staying in the Willamette Valley. I'm doing Larry's catalog, finishing the archives for your center, and rebuilding my online shop right from here." Stephanie agreed to talk on Sunday. It isn't forgiveness yet, but it's a genuine beginning. She hadn't stayed because I made leaving difficult. She had stayed because she had finally built enough reasons of her own. "That sounds like a real life," I said. "I think it just might be." I stepped back toward the door. The room, the income, and the decisions were entirely hers now. Nothing between us depended on my guest room anymore, which meant I could finally ask for what I actually wanted without wondering whether she felt cornered by convenience. "Kathy," I called out. I stopped. She crossed the room until barely a foot of space remained between us, still holding the studio key in her hand. "I gave back your house key," she said quietly. "I'm not your guest anymore." "I know." "So, ask me again." I had spent years saying practical things because practical things couldn't humiliate me. This time, I said the exact thing I wanted. "Will you go on a real date with me tonight? Not as an appraiser, and not as someone I'm helping out. I just want to date you, Kathy. Her breath caught. For the first time since we met, she glanced toward an exit and didn't move an inch toward it. Her thumb pressed hard against the ridged edge of her new key. I want to say yes, she admitted, but I literally just got a door that belongs entirely to me. I don't want to wake up a month from now and realize I turned your house into the place I run to whenever my own life gets hard. I don't want liking you to ever feel like needing permission to keep what I built. The hesitation stung, but it didn't frighten me. It wasn't a refusal. It was the honest truth she had once spent years avoiding. I'm not asking for your key, I said. I'm asking for a date. You keep your door. I'll knock when I'm invited. Kathy looked down at the key in her palm, then back up into my eyes. And if I desperately need a night alone, I go home. If I change my mind about dinner, you tell me. And if this whole thing gets difficult, we don't disappear on each other. Her expression softened completely. That rule goes both ways. It certainly should. The last bit of tension vanished from her shoulders. She closed her fingers tightly around the key, keeping it safe, and stepped that final foot closer. Yes, she whispered. I want to date you too. The tightness in my chest dissolved. I raised a hand, pausing just before touching her. Can I kiss you? She answered with a quiet yes, then closed the remaining distance herself, her hands resting softly against my chest. The kiss was warm, deliberate, and entirely unhurried, free of any desperate need to prove anything. When we finally pulled apart, she stayed close enough that I could feel the steady rhythm of her breath. 7 o'clock? I asked. 7. I returned at 7 wearing a clean shirt to find her waiting at the bottom of the stairs. We took the pickup truck instead of the motorcycle because the evening air had turned crisp. The steakhouse sat right along the river, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of us mentioned the trunk, the archives, or where she had slept that week. She told me about the very first item she ever sold online. A chipped blue vase she bought for $4 and shipped out inside an old cereal box. I told her about my first month managing the center when I accidentally ordered 40 child-sized life jackets because I had read the inventory code backward. She laughed out loud, then asked what I ever did with them. Started a youth program the following summer, I said. That sounds suspiciously like turning a catastrophic mistake into an administrative policy. It was a very safe mistake. The light-hearted banter faded, and a comfortable conversation settled in until the restaurant staff began stacking the chairs around us. Back outside her studio, I stopped at the foot of the stairs. She had her own door now, and I wanted her to feel the weight of it. Good night, Cole, she said. Good night, Kathy. She climbed 3 steps, turned back, and smiled at me before stepping inside. I drove home to a house that felt entirely different simply because I wanted someone there, and had finally found the courage to say so. 3 months later, the valley had turned a brilliant, golden autumn. Kathy ran her thriving online business from the studio above Larry's shop while working 2 paid cataloging days downstairs each week. The Alder Ridge archives were officially completed, with her name printed right beside mine on the project title page because history belongs to the work, not to whoever happens to own the filing cabinets. Stephanie came back for a weekend visit. The reunion wasn't a dramatic Hollywood scene of instant, picture-perfect forgiveness. The 2 women spent the entire first hour talking far too carefully around each other. Stephanie gently admitted that complete trust hadn't returned overnight just because the catalog was brilliant. Kathy didn't defend herself or push for a timeline. I know, she simply said. I'll keep showing up. By the second evening, they were sitting out on my back porch arguing passionately over whether a dented brass lantern was an antique treasure or just plain ugly. The missing years still hovered between them, But neither woman used silence to escape anymore. They kept talking. As for Kathy and me, we had been dating intentionally for 3 months. She still kept her studio. I still kept my cedar house. Some nights we ate above Larry's shop with shipping boxes stacked high against the walls. Other nights she walked over to my place and covered half my dining table with archive proofs again. I had long since changed the guest room, though not into a hidden trap to make her move in. The blank bed was gone, replaced by a cozy reading chair, a drafting table, and a photography lamp set up by the window. Kathy still kept working on her maps right there because she knew she always had a place to return to. She had a key to my house, and I had finally learned how to keep the door open.